The Sonoran Desert, Arizona. It's hot and it's very dry. Despite the harshness of the climate, there is an abundance of vegetation. Now, if the world's temperature was on average a few degrees higher than now, as we believe it was in the Cretaceous, would the world's vegetation be dominated by plants such as these? You've probably seen pictures of Cretaceous dinosaurs set against desert landscapes. But this picture would be wrong, at least in emphasis. But before we examine the Cretaceous world in detail, let me show you just how subtle the relationship between plants and climate can be.
Because all plants growing in the same area experience similar conditions, whole communities or even ecosystems display characteristics typical of the prevailing climate. So we can readily recognize a desert community as distinct from a rainforest, for example, without knowing the names of any of the species involved. Even unrelated plants evolving in isolation but growing in similar climates can end up looking much the same, such as this cactus from North America on the right, and this euphorbia from South Africa on the left. We call this convergent evolution, and it occurs when the same strategy is adopted to deal with a universal problem.
In order to survive here, I have to take in at least 5 litres of water a day to replace that lost through evaporation. Now, the plants have a similar problem, but they can't just go and turn on a tap. Water in the soil is in very short supply. So how have the plants become adapted to the severe constraints imposed by the climate?
To limit water loss, plants can only afford to have small leaves, and relatively few of them, because it's through the leaves that most water is lost to the atmosphere. Many desert plants have become so highly adapted that they've lost leaves altogether. They even store water in their stems. The vertical pleats in this giant saguaro permit expansion when water is available. But adaptations needn't be obvious architectural ones. They may be biochemical. Take these desert plants. Many of them have a special kind of chemistry that fixes carbon dioxide at night when the stomata are open and stores it as a 4-carbon sugar to be released for photosynthesis during the day when the stomata are closed. Keeping stomata closed during the heat of the day saves water that would otherwise escape into the hot, dry air outside. Leaving the desert behind, we climb up the mountain, and although the saguaros cover the foothills, there's a level above which none are found. At 1,200 meters, that's 4,000 feet, we begin to find small trees. But at this altitude, the leaves are not very big at all. Although the leaves of this oak are slightly larger than those on plants on the desert floor, they're still only a few square centimeters in area. They're shiny because they have a thick, waxy surface that helps to stop them drying out. Similar features are shared by the manzanita with its small, evergreen, leathery, resinous leaves. The resins also help to reduce water loss during the hot, dry summers. The manzanita is just one of several shrubs found in this dry scrub. Although at more or less the same altitude, in more sheltered and wetter areas, there's something else.
Suddenly, this tree-type vegetation has appeared, although leaf size is still quite small. What this tells us is that we've moved into a slightly different climate regime. Over a vertical distance of perhaps not more than 100 metres, the strategies adopted by the cacti and succulents have been replaced by a very different way of dealing with what amounts to quite a subtle change in climate.
As we move higher still, the average temperature and water stress decreases. This is reflected in an increase in leaf size, such as we see in these oaks. These are no longer the emery oak, but the Arizona white oak, which is better suited to the cooler, slightly less dry climate at this altitude. Oaks, like magnolias, beeches and alders, belong to the flowering plants, or angiosperms. It's the woody angiosperms that reflect most clearly the prevailing climate in their leaf architecture.
Now, the forest below me is essentially dominated by one species of oak, the emery oak. That's because the conditions there are just right for it, giving it a competitive edge over other plants. Now, we can define these conditions quite precisely in terms of temperature, rainfall, soil type, etc. So if we find a plant in a fossil record that has similar features to the emery oak, that tells us something about the conditions that existed when that plant was alive. But I want to show you something else further up the mountain.
Above 1,800 metres, about 6,000 feet, the oaks, angiosperms, are gradually displaced by pines and other conifers, gymnosperms, which grow best at an altitude where even summer temperatures are cool and water is more plentiful. But there's more mountain yet.
Yes, I've moved up from the t-shirt to the sweater zone. I'm at about 8,000 feet, or over 2,500 metres above sea level. The temperature and precipitation here is quite different to what we saw further down the mountain. Here, the average annual rainfall is about 10 times what it is in the saguaro zone, and the average annual temperature is about 10 degrees Celsius lower. Now, I hope you'll agree that what we've seen as we've come up the mountain is a remarkable series of changes in vegetation type. In a vertical distance of about 5,000 feet, we've essentially gone from low latitude to high latitude. We've gone through the same vegetational zones that we would see if we travelled at sea level between, say, Mexico and Canada. But we've done it in one place, Mount Lemmon, near Tucson, Arizona. Now, what all this shows is that there is a very close relationship between vegetation and climate. Vegetation is a very sensitive climatic indicator.
And when it comes to understanding past climate, vegetation analysis provides the essential clues. Although it all rather depends on exactly how the past climate record has been preserved.
A jump back down the mountain and a jump back in time. What was going on during the Cretaceous? Well, 100 million years ago, there was a lot of carbon sequestering taking place. But a glance around me shows me that this is not the environment in which that was happening. There's very little organic matter, and certainly no means for concentrating and preserving it. There's very little soil. This was not the site for the terrestrial carbon dump, coal.
This was Cretaceous vegetation, and the energy and gases being released as this Cretaceous coal burns are, in a sense, fossil sunshine and fossil air. Cretaceous plants used ancient sunlight to fix carbon from carbon dioxide in the Cretaceous atmosphere. And that carbon, reconverted to CO2, is now, almost 100 million years later, being re-released into our air.
Here, near the southern tip of New Zealand, there are natural exposures of late Cretaceous coal. When the coal was being formed, New Zealand was well within the Antarctic Circle, where today there's just snow and ice. In this exposure, there are several meters of coal, but this doesn't represent the full thickness of the coal that once existed. At some time in the past, a fast-flowing river eroded away the top of the coal seam and brought in this conglomerate.
It's a common misconception that coal, the remnants of ancient plants, is only formed in tropical swamps. It isn't. In the Cretaceous, most coal was being formed at high latitudes. Very large quantities of coal were formed near the poles, both here in New Zealand and in northern Alaska. At the Kaitangata open-cast mine in southern New Zealand, the coal is easily accessible, and so how it formed can be studied in detail.
So Tim, it's obvious there's lots of coal here, but we're only really seeing it in section. What do these coal bodies look like in 3 dimensions?
That's a good question. They're shaped more or less in a pod manner, like this, and when you get more than one seam, because like we have here, we have this seam here, but we have another one below us and another one below that, and they're actually, in this case, stacked one upon the other in this particular shape, which is only a few kilometers by a few kilometers. And then these, at any particular time slice, are also separated from the next pod over by paleochannels.
2 such pods are being worked here, separated by about 100 meters of conglomerate. They represent the Mayas in the polar forests, and clearly they were very effective carbon sequestering systems. Coal is highly compacted peat derived from the accumulation of dead plants. Rotting is limited by excluding oxygen, usually underwater. If the rate of organic accumulation in a subsiding basin keeps pace with the subsidence, great thicknesses of peat form that, when buried, transform into thick coal seams. But to understand more about the vegetation that produced these coals, we have to take a sample and look at it under the microscope.
Well, Bob, this is one of the polished coal sections. It's viewed with the microscope behind me here and is in reflected light. The field of view is about 1/3 of a millimetre in this case, and what we can see is the leaf cuticle here, which is the dark material. We realised that some of the coals were quite distinctive for reasons that we did not understand. We thought probably we could explain these distinctions by the original plant assemblages that grew when the peat was accumulating in the peat mires, but we had no information about these ancient plants. The other thing which we felt must be important was the ancient climate, and again we had no information about that, and this was very frustrating.
The solution was to turn to palynology, the study of pollen, which can be extracted from the coal sample by oxidizing away unwanted organic material, concentrating residues, and finally staining the pollen for conventional microscopy.
Pollen's made of an extremely resilient organic material. It survives almost everything you can throw at it in the lab. Pollen grains will survive effectively forever. So we can extract them by using that wonderful property.
And this particular sample from the Kaitangata seam contains very many different individuals and several different forms of this kind of angiosperm pollen known as the Proteaceae.
It turns out that the plants that first colonize the mire and develop in the surrounding ground are angiosperms. As the conditions become more demanding and nutrient supply perhaps declines, the gymnosperm and fern population is more competitive, and this establishes in preference to the angiosperm community.
This pollen form has the same shape, the same morphology as the Huon pine, which lives in the Tasmanian rainforest today. The interesting thing about this plant is it has a lot of vegetative reproduction. When the rivers flood, they knock over the branches, and from those branches new shoots and roots grow, such that the plant is never actually destroyed by the flooding event. And recent DNA work has shown that a single plant can extend for more than 20 kilometres along the banks of a river.
We can build up a picture of the vegetation in these communities, but what's the regional community like?
What we see is actually not too different from what is often in New Zealand today. The trees are dominated by podocarps mostly, and also some araucarians.
Related to the monkey puzzles?
Related types, yes. There'll be an understory of plants which will be dominated by ferns. Tree ferns are quite common, and also low-growing scrambling ferns such as Glycenia, a scrambling coral fern which lives today in New Zealand and Australia and elsewhere. And there'll be a few shrubby angiosperms growing low under the canopy as well.
All this took place much closer to the pole than New Zealand's position today. During the Cretaceous, these forests were at paleolatitudes of 65, 70, or perhaps slightly more degrees south. So we get a picture of a warm, wet environment close to the pole, sequestering large amounts of carbon in the southern hemisphere. But to get a very detailed picture of the Cretaceous climate, we have to find something that will give us a lot more information than what we can extract from just the coals.
I'm a paleobotanist. I study fossil plants. Much of my interest in plant fossils arises from the fact that they can tell us a great deal about past climates. Elsewhere in New Zealand, there are several locations close together where lots of plants from the Cretaceous polar forests have been preserved. And I'm on my way to those now. They're in a very remote area, over a coastal mountain range near Kaikoura, on the South Island of New Zealand. We're now approaching the first of the localities. One of special interest because it gives a time constraint for the fossil vegetation found there. The brown, rather blocky formation is volcanic, and it lies on top of sediments, the grey rocks with the whitish bands. Marine rocks, which you can't quite see yet, lie stratigraphically below. A few hundred metres upstream, those marine rocks become fully exposed. We're flying past them now. So this is what we saw from the air. A large series of volcanics, basalts, overlying a series of sediments known as the Warder Formation. At the contact between the volcanics and the sediments, we see that the more resistant volcanics jut out and the softer sediments have weathered back. Also at that junction, we find a fossil soil, or paleosol. Now this tells us that when the volcanics were extruded as lavas, they covered a landscape supporting vegetation. Let's go down the section and see what we can find out about that landscape.
There appears to be a repeating cycle of organic-rich deposits with thin coals representing a patchwork of Mayas. Periodically, these were buried by an influx of sand, suggesting the floodplain of some great river. On the undersurface of one sandstone block, there's an easily recognizable fossil leaf, an angiosperm. Stratigraphically underlying these strongly dipping sediments are some rocks which are predominantly horizontal.
We know these rocks are marine because they contain, together with ammonites and fish teeth, a mid-Cretaceous species of Inoceremus. This is a mollusk, an extinct benthic marine bivalve. So we can date the volcanics downstream radiometrically. We can date the marine rocks using fossils. This constrains the age of the water formation as somewhere between 95 and 100 million years. On to the next location. We're following in the footsteps of a famous New Zealand explorer and geologist, Alexander Mackay, to the Great Clarence River, where I'm going to camp for a few days. With me on this trip is one of my OU research students, Liz Kennedy, and a BBC film crew making this programme. Breakfast is next to the Alexander Mackay Terrace, one of the major fossil sites. OK, Liz, if you tight your end of the aerial on that bush over there, and I'll do this one over here. We're really quite isolated, so every evening at 8 o'clock we hope the ionosphere is functioning properly and attempt to make contact with the outside world with our mountain radio. I don't believe it.
Tomorrow morning, strong, colder southerlies developing with further heavy rain and
Southerlies.
snow above 1,200 metres on the...
Although we have a helicopter at the start and finish of the trip, we don't have it all the time. A constant worry is whether the river will be in flood, because two of the fossil sites are on the other bank. Fortunately, this year, despite the rain, the river wasn't too bad, and using a fixed rope we could get across it and back to our camp quite safely. The only flat land here is the floodplain of the Clarence River. Each year, spring floods erode the Alexander Mackay Terrace. Every time we return to collect more fossils, we get more glimpses of the Cretaceous vegetation it contains. The sediments have been tilted tectonically, but that's convenient. We can get at the fossil assemblages much more easily that way. Hang on a minute, Liz. We'll just check where we are on the section. Yeah, I think that one with the ripples is bed 213, so this would be 214.
Okay.
The sediments are quite varied, and that shows a lot was going on.
You see anything?
Despite appearances, fossils are not hard to find.
Oh, hang on, there's some nice ferns down here.
Oh yeah, under the...
The section at Alexander Mackay Terrace is a series of interbedded sands, silts and poor quality coals deposited by rivers, lakes and mires. Throughout the formation you can find fossil logs like this one, flattened by tectonic compression. Plant fossils, though found in both coal and shale, are best preserved in the less friable sandstone. These are leaves of agathis, a conifer that is still common in present-day New Zealand. The thin coals formed from a community of plants in a mire environment. And from time to time, the mires were buried when nearby rivers were in flood. Just as they do today, these rivers brought in leaves from the wooded banks and deposited a rich fossil flora more varied than that found in the coals, and therefore representing a regional vegetation. This ranges from an easily recognisable dicot leaf, very similar to the leaves of contemporary New Zealand angiosperms, to the ginkgo, the maidenhair tree. A distinctive fossil cycad. And these podocarp leaves, fossils of conifers which flourish even today in many countries in the southern hemisphere.
All set? You know, we really haven't improved on Ian's 22 taxa from this site, so I know it's lousy weather, but we'll just have to continue on
I reckon we've still got 15 metres.
To analyse species richness and relative abundance, we need to find lots of fossil leaf litter.
There was a nice angiosperm on this one. You see this one? It was on the,
Yeah, I saw that
it was
one.
on the underside.
We might be able to clear that off when we get back to the lab.
But then to reconstruct the paleo environment and to relate these fossil assemblages to global climate, we need to consider what was happening in the northern hemisphere.
Yeah, right.
Are similar fossils found near the North Pole as well?
It's on there, but really the story begins at the other side of the world, an even more remote area of Alaska, northern Alaska. And in that part of the world, we have a similar set of rocks. Rocks that were deposited 100 million years ago, but of course very close to the North Pole. And these rocks contain an equal wealth of leaf fossils, wood fossils, even dinosaur remains. And using this material, really since the 1970s, we've been able to reconstruct in some detail the vegetation, the polar vegetation of that time.
I think it's about 8 bob.
We're talking about forests growing with maybe 3 months total darkness each year. Now in those conditions today, there are no forests, it's just ice and tundra.
Then in 1983, a coincidence occurred when Ian Daniel and John Lovis rediscovered the fossil plants at the Mackay Terrace and published an abstract about them. Ian Daniel is still working on the rocks he collected.
Now, the first time we saw this material, it was in the laboratory in University of Canterbury at Christchurch. And it became immediately obvious that what we were seeing was a mirror image of what we'd seen in Alaska. That individual sediments contained essentially the same types of plants, although they were completely different species. Morphologically, architecturally, the plants were exactly the same as we'd seen in Alaska. But as I said, they were different species. Now we see this type of parallelism if you go to a tropical rainforest, for example, in Southeast Asia. It looks very similar to a tropical rainforest in Africa or South America, even though the individual species might be different. But to actually see this in vegetation that was 100 million years old was very exciting. So independent of their genetic lineages almost, they are ending up looking the same, because the environmental constraints are the the same on all the plants growing in that environment. So the plants tend to look the same.
But how did these polar forests give rise to the enormous amount of carbon sequestered? After all, that's not how we think of our contemporary polar environments.
This snow-covered landscape is at only 58 degrees north. To see a similar landscape in the Cretaceous, we'd have to be at 85 degrees or above, within a few hundred kilometers of the poles. There's another difference between today and the Cretaceous. Vegetation today, at high latitude, is very often evergreen. In the Cretaceous, where temperatures were higher and it was dark for a long period of time, a different strategy was used. They were deciduous.
To grow vegetables in Norway, they warm and illuminate their greenhouses at night in the winter.
So when were these sown?
In January,
And they'll be ready for planting out when?
in May.
In May.
If you come this way, I'll show you the control system.
Now, when it's warm, as it was during the Cretaceous, what problem would a leafy plant face when trying to survive the long polar night?
It runs the risk of actually using up all of its stored food reserves before the lights come back on in the spring. So the plant dies. A much better strategy is to get rid of all of that leaf load. Shed your leaves, reduce the respiratory drain, impose dormancy, go to sleep for 3 months. And then when the spring comes, you use less energy producing relatively cheap leaves, thin, papery leaves instead of thick evergreen ones.
Plants that do retain their leaves year-round, like this agathis, also have to overcome the problem of drying out, so their leaf cuticle, the surface membrane keeping water in, has to be thick. We can see this in the thickened cell walls of this 100-million-year-old agathis cuticle. Whereas an equally old deciduous species of agathis has thin walls.
It would be wrong to say that all plants in this greenhouse polar environment were deciduous. But on balance, most plants adopt the deciduous habit because it's that which is more efficient under those circumstances.
The combination of high summer productivity and autumnal shedding of large amounts of organic material gives rise to the high accumulation of carbon we see today in New Zealand and in Alaska. So these polar forests were mostly deciduous, accounting in part for the rich fossil remains we find. But exactly how do we begin to pin down the mean annual temperature, the mean annual precipitation?
There are two ways of doing this. You can reconstruct the whole vegetation and say what kind of vegetation today is most similar to this reconstructed ancient vegetation. So, for example, if we reconstructed this as being a cool, temperate forest, maybe conifer-dominated with some angiosperms, we could say, well, where today does that forest grow? Under what conditions does that forest grow? And use that to make our predictions or retrodictions of what the past was like. But there's a more sophisticated way.
Although they don't contain dragons, present-day tropical forests possess a high biodiversity. Yet many of the trees, despite belonging to different species, display a similar leaf architecture. This is in Singapore, the Bukit Timah Nature Reserve, an area of tropical rainforest almost on the equator.
In this warm, wet environment, many of the leaves show special adaptations. They tend to be quite large, have smooth margins, and a special drawn-out tip for shedding water from the leaves. Now, if we find these features on fossil leaves, we can say something about the conditions under which the plants which gave rise to those fossils once lived. Although it doesn't look like it, this leaf was produced by a tree which is a close relative of oaks and sweet chestnuts. Unlike oaks and sweet chestnuts that grow in a temperate environment, this leaf has a smooth margin. Now, the plant itself has adapted in a number of other ways to being in a rainforest environment. It's grown tall and has a spreading umbrella-like crown.
Early this century, it was noticed that in temperate forests, the leaves of woody flowering plants like oaks and willows tended to have toothed margins, while their relatives and other angiosperm species found in the tropics had smooth margins. Curiously, the ratio of toothed to smooth was proportional to the mean annual temperature. Could it be that there is even more climate information embedded in leaf morphology? And could it be quantified?
The leaves of woody angiosperms are known to be correlated with climate. The leaves possess a number of features or characters that we can break down into individual sets, and we can score these numerically. What I have here is a series of leaves that were taken from the vegetation around me. Let's take one leaf and go through this procedure of assigning characters. The first character we're going to look at is the margin. And I have a series of margin characters here, and this particular one, showing that the teeth on the edge of the leaf are widely spaced, is the one that is appropriate. This leaf is not very large. Nevertheless, there is a size category which we can assign to the leaf. The apex is quite pointed, so we'll use an acute apex. The base, however, is rounded, so we'll use a round base to describe this leaf. The length to width ratio is approximately 1 to 2 to 1. While the overall shape is elliptic. That means that the widest point is about halfway down the length of the leaf. So here we have our leaf described in terms of its component characters. And if we give numbers to each of these characters, we assign a numerical score to that leaf.
We can do the same thing for the leaves of all the woody angiosperms that exist in a particular area. And we can produce an overall numerical score for that particular vegetation. By doing the same thing for many vegetation sites for which the climate is known, we can correlate leaf characters to a range of climate variables. And this is the basis of a technique which we can also use for determining paleoclimate from fossil leaves.
Several weeks have passed since we're in the field. The fossil material has been returned to the laboratory, and it's been scored using exactly the same characters as we used for the living vegetation. We now need to see which characters are correlated with which climate variables. And the best way of doing that is to use what is known as multivariate statistical analysis.
The purpose of this statistical technique is to represent complex data in its most simplified form, and that is what is being shown here. On this three-dimensional plot, each dot is a point in space, and it represents a sample of modern vegetation, scored using the characters of woody angiosperm leaves. Every vegetation sampled, studied, has been color-coded for the observed mean annual temperature under which it grew. Quite clearly, there's an ordering of the points from red to blue, warm to cold. And there are axis lines, or vectors, onto which all the points in space can be projected. For instance, the dark blue line is the mean annual precipitation vector.
In fact, we can identify at least 8 vectors: mean annual temperature, warm month mean temperature, cold month mean temperature, mean annual precipitation, precipitation during the growing season, mean monthly growing season precipitation, precipitation during the 3 driest months, and the duration of the growing season. Furthermore, we can calibrate each of these vectors because we know what the observed climate is for each of our modern samples.
Now, if we score an assemblage of fossil leaves using the same characters as the living ones, our fossil flora will plot somewhere in this leaf character space. And by projecting the position of our fossil flora onto the calibrated climate vectors, we can determine the climatic conditions under which our ancient vegetation grew.
Unfortunately, fossil leaves do not occur everywhere in the rock record. Even if we could analyse all floras, we would still have a very incomplete view of past climates. To obtain a global view of past climates, to understand where carbon was sequestering, how rock weathering was taking place, and how the atmosphere-biosphere systems were working in conjunction, we need to use computer-based models.
To do that, we need to find someone who models the weather. Someone who can translate the principles of weather modelling to provide an integrated view of ancient climates. One that can be compared to the climate predicted from our fossil sites.
Basically, I'm making a weather forecast for 100 million years ago. And so you can get any variable that you want to look at. We get temperature, rainfall, cloud cover. A lot of them you can't test against a geological record, obviously, but things like temperature, rainfall, soil moisture are the sort of things that the geological record can tell us whether our model is doing the right thing or not.
What Paul's computer model shows is a prediction of the surface temperature for a typical year 100 million years ago. The blues are below freezing, and in January, in the northern hemisphere, winter temperatures drop down to as low as -20 Celsius.
Now that sounds cold, but of course present-day Greenland, for instance, would have temperatures of -50 degrees centigrade in those places. So it is really very strikingly warmer in these model simulations.
Continuing the model through the seasonal cycle, the blue areas decrease in size as we go into the northern hemisphere springtime. But equally, the southern hemisphere is cooling off with midwinter in July. Again, the lowest temperatures there are about -20 Celsius.
One of the important predictions of the model is that there are no ice caps at either pole. That it gets cold in winter, but the warmth in the corresponding summer is enough to melt any snow that falls. And so the models are predicting no permanent ice, and that is, broadly speaking, consistent with what the geological record suggests.
So we're a lot warmer at the poles, but what does that mean as far as the global average is concerned?
Well, the estimates suggest that the global average temperatures were increased by about 4 to 6 degrees centigrade or thereabouts.
Compared to present?
Compared to present day. And perhaps it's interesting to point out that in terms of the predictions for future climate change, the rise of temperature is expected to be about 2 to 4 degrees centigrade. So the Cretaceous was as warm or warmer than anything that we expect in the future.
Another computer model displays the soil moisture content, the amount of water left in the soil after rain, and allowing for the loss of some water by evaporation. Here, mustard yellow means that the soil is saturated. It can't hold any more water. Uncoloured means dry. The model shows clearly that the regions close to the poles were very wet, and that correlates well with the coals that we find in those areas.
By looking at the past, looking at the Cretaceous, looking at this period which was very warm and which had high carbon dioxide concentrations, that's a way of testing the model, seeing whether they're going to have the right climate sensitivity, whether they make the right predictions of change. These models are actually used to predict the future. What we can do is we can gradually increase carbon dioxide in the same way that we think that man-made change will do it. And so again, we can look at those predictions and compare them to what we're seeing in the Cretaceous.
So, off to Norway in search of some hard evidence.
If we want to study the effect of elevated carbon dioxide and temperature on vegetation, in other words, the greenhouse effect, what better place to come than where there's a greenhouse?
Here at the Climax experiment, an area of natural vegetation has been enclosed. It's been supplied with additional carbon dioxide and maintained several degrees warmer than the outside temperature. The idea is to predict how natural vegetation will respond to possible future climate change.
In this warmer, enhanced CO2 environment, we might expect there to be changes in plant productivity. We can measure those changes by examining the amount of leaf material that's produced, or by measuring the diameter of trunks or branches. However, the major question that we need to answer is, are these short-term effects, rather like you would get if you fertilized a garden, or will they be translated into long-term ecological change?
The resolution to that CO2 issue is still on hold, so how does paleontology help?
See where the models are getting it right, see where the models are getting it wrong. Even alter our means of interpretation of the rock and fossil record if necessary. And in this sort of iterative back and forth way, we will understand a lot more about what the world's systems, atmosphere, biosphere, geosphere, hydrosphere, how all those systems interact and operate in a world which is warmer than our present one, and one which we might be moving to in the future.
175, did you copy the weather forecast? Do you have any messages? Over.
Yeah, we copy the weather forecast, thanks very much. We have no messages. Over.
Okay,